Welcome to my channel. Today we're going back to one of the most haunting mysteries in aviation history, a story that began with a calm voice in the cockpit and ended in a silence so deep it took investigators years to understand what truly happened. This is the story of Flight 611, a flight that began like any other and ended in fragments scattered across the ocean, where a single piece of wreckage, the last one recovered, finally revealed a truth no one wanted to believe. It was a quiet morning when Flight 611 prepared for takeoff from Taipei, bound for Hong Kong. The weather was perfect, the crew was experienced, the aircraft, a Boeing 747, had been flying for years without issue. Passengers boarded with the usual mixture of routine and relief, some heading home, others chasing business or vacation. Families waved from the terminal windows, unaware that this would be their final goodbye. In the cockpit, the captain made his final check. The engines roared to life, a sound so familiar that no one in the cabin gave it a second thought. As the giant aircraft lifted into the clear blue sky, everything seemed normal. But high above the clouds, a ghost was waiting, an invisible flaw buried deep within the aircraft's skin, a wound that had been festering for over 2 decades. For the first hour, nothing seemed out of place. Passengers settled in, coffee was served, and the flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisles. The cockpit chatter was calm, technical, and steady, the sound of experience in motion. Yet, as the plane climbed to cruising altitude, one of the crew members noted something subtle on the instrument panel, a vibration, small and intermittent, almost imperceptible. The captain glanced at it, then brushed it off. Every aircraft had quirks. Every vibration had an explanation. But what none of them could see was what lay hidden just behind the smooth metal skin, a fracture that had been waiting, patient and silent, for 22 years. The fracture began long before that flight, on a different day, in a different sky. In 1980, the same plane had suffered a tail strike, a hard landing that scraped its fuselage along the runway. The damage was repaired, or so everyone believed. But part of the repair was done wrong. Instead of replacing a critical section of metal, the technicians patched over it, sealing in a weakness that time would only make worse. 4 years, the plane flew without issue, each takeoff and landing adding tiny, invisible lines to the fracture's edges. It was like a heartbeat, steady, hidden, unstoppable. As Flight 611 crossed the coastline that morning, air traffic control monitored it without concern. The radar screen showed a calm, steady flight path. The pilots chatted with ground controllers, voices relaxed and cheerful. The passengers gazed out the windows at the endless blue, unaware that disaster was already unfolding at a microscopic level within the plane's structure. Every gust of wind, every change in pressure pushed the weakened metal further, like a whisper of doom creeping through the frame. And then, without warning, the aircraft shuddered. A sound, deep and guttural, like a roar from inside the walls, filled the cabin. The pilots felt it instantly, a vibration that wasn't supposed to be there. In the cockpit, alarms began to sound. The captain called out to his crew, his voice sharp but calm, "Check systems." Seconds later, there was a sound no pilot ever wants to hear, a loud bang, followed by the rush of decompression. Oxygen masks dropped. The plane lurched violently. Cabin pressure vanished in an instant as a section of the fuselage tore away, exposing the sky itself. The last transmission from the cockpit was a broken, desperate call. "We are breaking up." Then silence. On radar, the green dot that represented Flight 611 flickered once, then disappeared. 4 hours, the control center called again and again. "Flight 611, do you copy?" But the ocean gave no answer. Families waiting at the airport watched as the arrival board turned from on time to delayed, and finally to missing. Search and rescue teams were deployed immediately, scouring the sea where the radar signal had vanished. What they found was devastating. Debris scattered across miles of water, seat cushions, clothing, twisted metal, and fragments of the aircraft's frame. The sheer size of the debris field told investigators what they already feared. The plane had disintegrated midair. There were no survivors. But the question that haunted everyone was simple: why? The Boeing 747 was one of the safest aircraft ever built. The weather was clear. The pilots were seasoned professionals. What could cause a plane to simply tear itself apart in midair? The first few weeks yielded little more than confusion. Investigators recovered hundreds of pieces of wreckage, each one a clue, each one a whisper from the dead. They meticulously catalogued every fragment, numbering each piece, building a puzzle no one was sure could ever be solved. Then came the 640th piece. It was small, just a section of the rear fuselage, corroded and crumpled by impact. But when forensic analysts examined it under magnification, they saw something no one expected: old fracture lines beneath the paint, stretching deep into the metal. This wasn't damage from the crash. It was damage from years ago. The metal had been tearing itself apart long before the aircraft ever left the ground that morning. The engineers realized that the patch from the 1980 tail strike had failed. The improper repair had allowed corrosion and stress to eat through the structure. By the time Flight 611 reached cruising altitude, the pressure inside the cabin had found the weakest point, and the plane literally split open midair. The passengers never stood a chance. The discovery sent shockwaves through the aviation world. The company responsible for the repair was confronted with evidence of negligence that had gone unnoticed for decades. Airlines around the world began inspecting older aircraft with renewed urgency. Safety inspectors traced the chain of decisions, trying to find the exact moment where a shortcut had been taken, where someone decided good enough was enough. That single choice had killed hundreds. The 640th piece of wreckage had not just solved the mystery, it had revealed a painful truth about complacency in maintenance, about how small mistakes can become catastrophic over time. When the final report was released, it read like an autopsy of both machine and humanity. The investigators wrote that the cause of the accident was a structural failure due to improper repair after the 1980 tail strike. But beneath the technical language lay a deeper message, a warning carved in metal and loss. Every flight, no matter how routine, carries the legacy of decisions made by unseen hand. And sometimes those decisions echo decades later, at 35,000 feet. In Taiwan, families gathered at a memorial built along the shore, facing the ocean where the plane had fallen. The names of every passenger were etched into stone, each letter glinting under the sunlight. Relatives laid flowers, their tears mixing with sea spray. For them, closure came not from the investigation, but from knowing the truth, that their loved ones hadn't vanished into mystery, but into memory. Flight 611's legacy changed aviation forever. New inspection techniques were developed, new regulations enforced, and every repair, no matter how small, was scrutinized to the finest detail. The ghost of that flight became a silent guardian over every aircraft that followed. Even now, every time a maintenance team checks a panel, every time an engineer signs off on a repair, the lesson of Flight 611 lingers in the back of their minds. It is a story written in steel, sealed by tragedy, and remembered through the smallest piece of wreckage, the last one that told the truth. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the courage and the lessons found in every tragedy, please consider subscribing to the channel. Here, we honor the stories that shaped the skies, the ones that remind us why every flight today carries not just passengers, but the memory of those who were lost and the safety bought with their sacrifice. The investigation into Flight 611 began the moment the last radar ping faded from the control tower's screens. In the hours following the disappearance, confusion rippled through every channel of communication. Taipei's air traffic controllers kept calling out to the flight, their voices trembling with disbelief. China Airlines 611, do you copy? But only silence answered. A few seconds later, controllers noticed something strange on their radar, a series of smaller blips appearing briefly before vanishing, scattered across the screen. At first, they thought it was interference. Then the realization hit: those weren't false echoes. They were debris falling from the sky. Within minutes, emergency protocols were activated. Search and rescue aircraft took off, their crews scanning the vast stretch of ocean that stretched between Taiwan and the Chinese mainland. But as daylight began to fade, the reality of what had happened grew clearer. Flight 611 had broken apart midair, and there were no survivors. The first fragments were discovered by fishermen before dawn the next day. They had gone out expecting a quiet morning at sea, but instead found the water littered with floating wreckage, seat cushions, suitcases, and fragments of the aircraft's fuselage shimmering under the early sunlight. The fishermen radioed the Coast Guard immediately, their voices shaking. One of them later said he would never forget the sight of a child's toy floating among the debris. That image, simple and devastating, spread through the nation like wildfire. Within hours, television networks were broadcasting live images of the recovery ships moving across the ocean, pulling twisted metal and personal belongings from the wave. At Taipei International Airport, grief turned into disbelief. Families who had come to greet loved ones now found themselves clutching photographs and waiting for news that would never come. Airline officials tried to maintain composure, but the questions began pouring in faster than they could answer. What happened? Why did the plane disintegrate in midair? How could a modern aircraft vanish so suddenly? The only certainty was the heartbreak left behind. Over the following weeks, the crash site became a floating investigation zone. Dozens of ships worked tirelessly to recover as much wreckage as possible. Each piece that was pulled from the sea was carefully marked, numbered, and transported to shore. The air smelled of fuel and salt as divers descended again and again into the dark depths, guided by sonar signals and faint reflections from metal fragments below. For the investigators, it was like piecing together a shattered mirror in the middle of an endless ocean. The goal was simple but monumental: to find enough evidence to tell the story of what had happened inside the sky that day. Among the first clues was the size of the debris field. It stretched for miles, a clear sign that the plane had broken apart at high altitude rather than crashing intact. This told investigators something vital: there had been no explosion, no fireball. The aircraft had literally torn itself apart in the air. That single realization changed the direction of the investigation. Experts began focusing on structural failure, something within the frame of the aircraft itself. But where? The wreckage recovered so far told only part of the story. The larger sections, the wings, the tail, and the fuselage skin, were scattered and fragmented beyond easy recognition. The investigators needed more. They built a reconstruction hangar, an enormous warehouse filled with tables, diagrams, and maps where every piece of the aircraft would be laid out like a massive puzzle. Day by day, new parts arrived. The engine housings, the landing gear, the cabin doors. Some pieces were scorched by heat, others twisted beyond recognition. Still, the team persisted. They washed, tagged, and recorded every fragment, often working through the night. One investigator described it as listening to the aircraft speak through silence. Each piece, no matter how small, carried a whisper of what had gone wrong. Then came a breakthrough. Part of the vertical stabilizer, or tail fin, showed signs of pre-existing stress. The edges weren't cleanly torn. They looked fatigued, stretched thin, as if they'd been under invisible strain for years. This was no ordinary structural failure. It hinted at something much older. But to confirm it, the investigators needed one thing: the missing link that would connect the past to the present. They needed the section of the fuselage where the metal had first failed, the area near the tail where pressure had ripped through the cabin walls. Weeks passed. Storms slowed recovery operations, and the sea swallowed as much evidence as it revealed. But the team refused to stop. Their dedication bordered on obsession. For them, this wasn't just about aviation. It was about justice for the 225 lives lost. Each new piece raised as many questions as it answered. Some fragments bore faint markings, maintenance numbers, inspection date. The more they analyzed, the more a disturbing pattern began to emerge. This plane, though well-maintained, had a history. Maintenance logs revealed that the same aircraft had suffered a tail strike over 20 years earlier. Records claimed it was repaired and certified safe. But the damage report was vague, and the documentation surrounding the repair was incomplete. Could the roots of this tragedy stretch that far back in time? Back at the reconstruction site, engineers began matching serial numbers to maintenance history. They traced every component, searching for evidence of the old repair. But it wasn't until a crate arrived containing several corroded fragments from the rear fuselage that the mystery began to unravel. Among the twisted metal was a section that immediately stood out, its edges discolored, the paint slightly uneven. Under a magnifying glass, investigators saw it clearly. A thin line of disbonding between metal layers, as if the patch had never been properly sealed. Their pulses quickened. They knew they were close. By the second month, the hangar looked less like chaos and more like a ghost of the aircraft reborn, its shape slowly taking form from hundreds of salvaged parts. Yet the most crucial section was still missing, the skin panel where the initial rupture had begun. Without it, the investigation was incomplete. Divers returned again and again to the coordinates where they believed the tail had fallen, braving dangerous currents and poor visibility. The ocean, vast and cold, guarded its secrets well. And then, one morning, a radio crackled across the investigation vessel. "We found it," a diver's voice said, almost in disbelief. A large fragment of fuselage had been located deep on the seabed, buried beneath layers of sand and coral. It was lifted carefully to the surface, covered in barnacles and silt. When it arrived on deck, the team knew instantly that this was different. It bore the plane's identification code, proof that this piece came from the precise area where investigators believed the rupture had begun. It was brought to shore under heavy guard, labeled Piece 640. When analysts examined it under bright light, what they saw confirmed their fears. The metal wasn't torn cleanly, it had peeled apart along old cracks, corrosion spreading like veins beneath the paint. Microscopic analysis showed multiple layers of fatigue, each one older than the next. This was no sudden failure. It was a slow death, decades in the making. The truth hit hard. The 1980 tail strike repair, which should have replaced the damaged section entirely, had instead been patched over. The metal sheets had been joined incorrectly, and the repair sealant had allowed moisture and pressure to creep in. Every flight since then had pushed the hidden fracture further and further, until finally, on that quiet morning over the Taiwan Strait, the structure gave way completely. The 640th piece became the voice of Flight 611. It told the world what words never could, that sometimes the smallest detail can decide the fate of hundreds. The investigation had its answer, but it came at the cost of generations of trust, forcing airlines around the world to confront uncomfortable truths about safety, maintenance, and responsibility. And as the families of the victims gathered along the shoreline, watching ships return with more fragments, one investigator said quietly to a reporter, "We've solved the mystery. But it doesn't feel like victory. It never does. The ocean had given them the truth, but the price was everything else." The discovery of the 640th piece changed everything. What had once been a fog of speculation and theory now began to take shape into a chilling, undeniable truth. Inside the reconstruction hangar, the atmosphere shifted. Where once there had been quiet grief and frustration, now there was focus, an urgency driven by the knowledge that the story of Flight 611 was finally beginning to speak through steel. Every investigator in the room could feel it. The truth wasn't hiding anymore. It was waiting to be understood. The fragment was carefully cleaned, dried, and placed on a long inspection table beneath harsh white light. Engineers gathered around it in silence, their faces tense. Under the microscope, the fracture lines spread outward like rivers on a map, each one marking a moment in time when the plane had carried passengers across the world, unaware that the metal beneath them was slowly tearing apart. At one edge of the panel, the paint was darker, almost blistered, evidence of corrosion that had grown for years between improperly bonded layers of aluminum. An older engineer, one who had investigated crashes for decades, ran his hand over the ridges and murmured, "This isn't a break. This is a wound that never healed." When they compared the damage with the repair records from 1980, everything clicked into place. The maintenance log from that year described a tail strike at Hong Kong's Kai Tak Airport, a notoriously difficult runway surrounded by mountains and crosswinds. The aircraft had struck the runway tail first during landing, scraping its fuselage along the concrete. It had been serious but not catastrophic. At the time, the airline's maintenance team performed what they believed was an adequate fix. But the engineers who reviewed the report now could see the flaw immediately. The repair didn't replace the damaged metal. Instead, it covered it with a doubler plate, essentially patching the wound instead of healing it. It was cheaper, faster, and completely within the safety rules of the time. But it was also a ticking bomb. In the years that followed, Flight 611's airframe endured thousands of pressurization cycles. Each time it climbed to altitude, the cabin was pressurized to keep passengers comfortable while the outside air thinned to nothing. That pressure stretched the weakened area just a little more each flight. Microscopic cracks began to grow, spreading like hairline fractures across glass. And because the patch looked perfectly fine on the outside, no one noticed. The aircraft passed every inspection, every maintenance check, every safety review. It was as if fate itself had decided to hide the truth in plain sight. The engineers took their findings to the crash board. The lead investigator, a quiet man with sharp eyes, stood before the press weeks later and said carefully, "We have determined that Flight 611 suffered an in-flight breakup caused by structural failure in the aft fuselage. The cause of that failure was an improper repair performed over 20 years earlier." The words hit the world like a hammer. Families who had been clinging to hope of a quick or merciful explanation were confronted with something far worse: human negligence buried under layers of bureaucracy. This was not an act of nature. It was an act of complacency. Inside the airline's headquarters, executives watched the press conference in stunned silence. Lawsuits began within days. Questions were raised in Parliament. How could something so small, so long forgotten, destroy an aircraft midair? How many other planes carried the same invisible scars? Airlines around the world scrambled to recheck old maintenance records, focusing on aircraft that had suffered tail strikes or major repairs decades ago. Hangars filled with technicians armed with ultrasound scanners and X-ray equipment. For many, this was not just about Flight 611, it was about re-examining the very trust between passengers and the machines that carried them through the sky. Meanwhile, back in Taiwan, the families of the victims gathered again and again by the sea. For them, the technical explanations brought no comfort. They didn't speak in the language of stress fractures and pressurization cycles. They spoke in the language of loss. Photographs of smiling loved ones hung from fences overlooking the ocean, ribbons fluttering in the wind. A mother clutched a picture of her daughter, who had been on her way to a dance competition in Hong Kong. "She was afraid to fly," the woman said softly. "I told her it would be safe." Those words, repeated across countless interviews, became the quiet heart of the tragedy: trust given freely, betrayed silently. As investigators pieced together the final moments of the flight, the horror of what had actually happened became clearer. The cockpit voice recorder had survived the crash, though its data was damaged. After painstaking recovery, they managed to restore several minutes of audio from the final phase of the flight. What they heard was the sound of calm professionalism turning into chaos in the blink of an eye. The captain's voice was steady as he discussed weather and altitude, then came a sudden loud noise, like thunder inside the cabin. A scream followed, then alarms. The first officer shouted about depressurization. The sound of rushing air filled the recording, and then, silence. The aircraft had come apart so fast that the crew never had a chance to send a distress call. Computer simulations later showed that once the fuselage ruptured, the cabin pressure dropped instantly, tearing away the tail section. The remaining structure lost balance, and within seconds, the entire plane disintegrated. The passengers never knew what hit them. For many, death came before fear could even register. That knowledge was a small mercy in an ocean of grief. Months passed, but the investigation didn't end with identifying the cause. Now came the harder part, understanding how the error had been allowed to exist for so long. Teams traced the paperwork, finding that the 1980 repair had been inspected by multiple authorities over the decades, each signing off without question. The patch had even passed a major safety audit just a few years before the crash. That meant it wasn't just a single failure, it was a chain of them. A system that had trusted documentation more than evidence, reputation more than reality. For the lead investigator, the emotional toll was immense. In interviews, he admitted that Flight 611 haunted him long after the case closed. "We found the truth," he said, "but it came far too late. The plane was screaming for help for 20 years. We just never heard it." Those words struck a chord with the global aviation community. They became a rallying cry for reform. New safety protocols were introduced. The industry mandated deeper structural inspections on aging aircraft, especially those with past damage. Airlines began using advanced scanning technologies that could detect corrosion and fatigue invisible to the naked eye. Engineers were retrained to understand not just how to fix metal, but how time itself could undo even the best repairs. The ghost of Flight 611 became a guardian of the skies, a tragic teacher no one would ever forget. And yet, despite all the progress, the ocean still held reminders of what had been lost. The families continued to visit the memorial, leaving white lilies that drifted into the tide. Each year on the anniversary, a small service was held. As the sun set, candles flickered against the waves. One survivor of another airline accident once stood among them, speaking softly to the crowd. "The sky forgets nothing," he said. "Every mistake, every lesson, it carries them all. And so must we." The 640th piece, the one that told the truth, was placed in a museum display under glass. Visitors would stand before it, staring at the twisted aluminum that had once held so many lives. To most, it looked ordinary, unremarkable. But to those who knew the story, it was sacred. It was the voice of Flight 611, the final witness to a chain of decisions that had cost 225 souls their tomorrow. In the end, the mystery wasn't solved by technology or luck, but by persistence, by the refusal to stop listening when the truth seemed buried. And though the world moved on, though newer planes rose into the sky, the echoes of that day lingered in every takeoff, every landing, every heartbeat of the engines. Because Flight 611 was not just a tragedy, it was a reminder that in aviation, as in life, the smallest oversight can grow into something catastrophic, and that sometimes it takes just one piece, the last piece, to reveal the truth. The months following the discovery of the 640th piece were filled with endless work, sleepless nights, and quiet heartbreak. The hangar where the wreckage of Flight 611 was reconstructed had become more than an investigation site. It was a sacred ground where metal carried memories, and every twisted fragment told the story of a life once in motion. Investigators no longer saw mere components of a Boeing 747, they saw faces, families, and unfinished stories trapped in the steel. The more they learned, the heavier the truth became. What they uncovered was not just a mechanical failure, it was the story of how time, neglect, and trust intertwined to create one of aviation's most haunting tragedies. Inside the hangar, the air was cold, filled with the constant hum of machinery. Technicians used magnifying lenses, lights, and ultrasonic tools to examine each fragment. Every piece was tagged and logged, then matched against blueprints of the aircraft. Slowly, a ghost of Flight 611 began to take form across the hangar floor. It wasn't complete, nothing ever could be, but it was enough to trace the path of destruction. The fracture had begun near the rear pressure bulkhead, a curved wall at the back of the cabin that kept the plane pressurized at high altitude. The patch applied after the 1980 tail strike sat right on that bulkhead. It was a fix that should have saved the aircraft's life, but instead, it became its death sentence. As investigators studied the section under microscopes, they found the truth written in the metal itself. The crack that destroyed Flight 611 had not appeared overnight. It had been growing invisibly for 22 years. Each takeoff, each landing, each pressurization cycle had stretched the weak joint a little more until, finally, the metal gave way. The last flight had simply been one flight too many. The realization left a silence in the hangar that no one dared to break. One engineer placed his hand on the metal and whispered, "You were trying to warn us." Outside the investigation, the pressure mounted. News channels across Asia and around the world followed the story relentlessly. Headlines read, "Decades-old mistake brings down Flight 611 and maintenance failure exposed after years of flying." Public anger swelled. Families demanded accountability, not just from the airline, but from the entire system that allowed such an oversight to pass undetected. The government announced a full review of maintenance standards, and the Civil Aviation Administration ordered airlines to immediately inspect all aircraft that had undergone major structural repairs. Airports became fields of activity as planes were grounded, checked, and scanned. Meanwhile, inside the investigation boardroom, another story was unfolding, a quieter, more personal one. The lead investigator, Captain Leong, had spent his entire career believing in the perfection of aviation systems. He had investigated crashes before, but this one was different. Every night, when the hangar lights dimmed, he would walk among the pieces of Flight 611, tracing the scars on the metal with his fingertips. He saw in them something human, the fragility of decisions made under pressure, the consequences of choosing convenience over caution. To him, this case wasn't just about identifying the cause, it was about redemption. He wanted to make sure the dead were not forgotten in a line of technical data, that their story became a warning carved into the memory of every airline engineer and mechanic across the world. When the final report neared completion, the board gathered to review the findings. The evidence was irrefutable. The tail strike in 1980, the improper repair, the corrosion that followed, the slow growth of the crack, and the final catastrophic failure. The words were clinical, but the reality they described was devastating. The report concluded that the accident resulted from metal fatigue due to improper structural repair performed after a prior tail strike. It also revealed that the faulty repair had been inspected multiple times over the years by both airline and aviation authorities, and each time it had passed. The room fell silent as the final paragraph was read aloud. The tragedy of Flight 611 reminds us that the smallest flaw, left unaddressed, can grow unseen until it becomes irreversible. When the report was released to the public, it hit like a storm. Families of the victims stood together outside the memorial built near the sea, holding candles as they listened to the official statement. Many cried, not only for their loss but for the cruel simplicity of the truth, that the accident could have been prevented if someone, somewhere, had paid closer attention. The airline issued a public apology, promising to overhaul its maintenance systems and create a permanent memorial for those lost. But for the families, no words could undo what had been done. One father stood before the cameras, his voice shaking. "My daughter was 12, he said quietly. All it would have taken was one person to care enough to check twice. His words broke through the noise of the press, echoing across the nation. In the months that followed, aviation safety changed around the world. Regulations were rewritten. Airlines were required to maintain detailed records of all major structural repairs for the entire lifespan of an aircraft. Inspectors began using advanced imaging technology that could detect internal damage invisible to the eye. Engineers were retrained to understand how time itself could wear down metal, how a patch could hide danger as easily as it could prevent it. The lessons learned from Flight 611 became mandatory study material for aircraft maintenance programs. What had once been an isolated tragedy was now shaping the very future of flight safety. But for those closest to the case, closure came in different ways. Captain Leong visited the crash site by boat one final time. The sea was calm, its surface smooth and silver in the light of dawn. He dropped a wreath of white flowers into the water and watched as they floated away, carried by the same waves that had once hidden the truth. In that moment, he thought of the 640th piece, the fragment that had given the dead a voice. It now sat in a museum in Taipei, preserved behind glass. Visitors often passed it without realizing what they were looking at, but for those who knew, it was sacred. A single piece of metal that held 22 years of silence and one terrible scream. In one of his final interviews before retirement, Leong said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. "A plane doesn't just fall from the sky," he said. "It tells us it's hurting. But sometimes we stop listening." Those words became the unofficial epitaph of Flight 611. For years afterward, investigators around the world quoted them in training sessions and conferences, reminding each other that technology may evolve, but the human element, the care, the attention, the humility, will always decide whether a flight is safe. For the families, life moved forward in slow, painful steps. Some returned to the sea every year on the anniversary of the crash, bringing flowers, whispering prayers. Others never came back, choosing instead to remember their loved ones as they had been, smiling, alive, untouched by tragedy. The memorial grew into a place of peace. At sunset, the engraved names of the passengers glowed gold, reflecting the last light of day onto the water. The sound of waves mingled with the soft murmur of the wind, and for a few moments, it felt as though the world itself paused to remember. Even now, decades later, when investigators teach new recruits about the case, they say that Flight 611 wasn't just an accident, it was a message written in the quiet language of metal fatigue, hidden corrosion, and overlooked maintenance logs. A message that cost 225 lives to be understood. It taught the world that even the smallest act of carelessness can ripple across decades, turning into catastrophe. And so, the story of Flight 611 became more than history, it became a vow. A vow that those who work in aviation would never stop listening, never stop questioning, and never allow the silence of one aircraft to become the silence of another. Because somewhere deep within the ocean, where the final fragments of Flight 611 rest, the sea still whispers its warning. That truth, no matter how deeply it's buried, will always find its way to the surface. The fifth stage of the Flight 611 investigation unfolded not just as a technical inquiry, but as an emotional reckoning. The world now knew what had caused the plane to tear apart midair, but the deeper story lay in the chain of choices that allowed it to happen. Inside the boardrooms, hangars, and families' homes, a haunting question echoed. How could a simple repair, made more than 20 years ago, kill hundreds of innocent people today? The answer wasn't just about engineering. It was about trust, accountability, and how easily human systems overlook the invisible cracks in their own walls. In Taipei, the investigators were nearing the end of their reconstruction. The massive hangar that had once been cluttered with thousands of twisted fragments now resembled the skeleton of a plane reborn, a ghostly outline of Flight 611 taking shape under the lights. Each part of the aircraft was numbered, studied, and positioned according to its place in the sky. Every rivet told a story. The rear pressure bulkhead, now mounted on a steel frame, bore the unmistakable scars of fatigue. The patch from the 1980 tail strike was still visible, its edges jagged, its sealant eaten away by corrosion. Engineers stared at it in silence. The realization that this small patch of metal had silently killed an entire flight weighed heavier than any finding before it. The investigators decided to run a full-scale simulation using computer models and physical tests. They recreated the 1980 repair process exactly as the maintenance crew had performed it, then simulated decades of pressurization cycles. Over time, microfractures appeared in the model, just as they had on the real aircraft. The computer showed how, at 39,000 feet, the expanding pressure inside the cabin finally overwhelmed the weakened joint. The cracks spread across the fuselage in less than half a second, ripping open a massive hole that destroyed the plane's structural integrity. The simulation ended with the digital aircraft shattering apart, just as Flight 611 had. The room went silent. No one spoke. It was as though the ghosts of that flight had just relived their final moments before their eyes. While the technical teams finalized the cause, the emotional weight of the tragedy began to sink deeper into the hearts of those left behind. Across Taiwan, Hong Kong, and mainland China, memorial services were held for the victims. Entire families had been lost, their names read aloud in soft voices that trembled with sorrow. In Taipei, a young man clutched a framed photo of his mother, who had been on her way to Hong Kong for a family reunion. She was terrified of flying, he said to a reporter, tears streaking his face. She called me before takeoff and said, "Don't worry, I'll be fine. It's just a short flight." He paused, staring at the sky. It wasn't supposed to be her last. The world watched in empathy. News anchors choked up while reporting the findings. Aviation forums buzzed with engineers debating how such a repair could have passed inspection for decades. But the most painful revelations came from the maintenance logs themselves. The investigators found that, after the 1980 tail strike, the mechanics had noted the extent of the damage, but due to pressure to return the aircraft to service quickly, a senior engineer had approved a shortcut, to apply a patch rather than replace the entire damaged section. It had been cheaper, faster, and, according to outdated safety rules, still technically acceptable. No one at the time imagined that a decision made under deadline pressure would one day kill 225 people. But that was exactly what had happened. The airline's leadership faced public outrage. Press conferences were filled with flashes of cameras and angry voices. The airline's CEO, with visible exhaustion, bowed deeply before the cameras in apology, his voice barely steady as he said, "We failed to protect our passengers. We failed to see what was hidden. For that, we will carry this guilt forever." Behind him, the airline's staff wore black ribbons pinned to their uniforms. They knew that, from this day forward, the name Flight 611 would never leave their history. It would be spoken not with numbers or codes, but with grief. International aviation bodies responded swiftly. Boeing engineers were brought in to consult on how to prevent similar structural failures. Airlines were ordered to review every old repair record from the last 30 years. Hangars across the world buzzed with the sound of ultrasonic testing equipment scanning for internal cracks. For once, it felt as though the world had truly learned from tragedy. But for those closest to the victims, the reforms were bittersweet. "It's good that no one else will die because of this," said one grieving father at a memorial service. "But it doesn't bring my son back. We gave them our trust, and they broke it." As time passed, the investigation report was finalized and presented to the public in a televised announcement. The lead investigator, Captain Leong, stood before the cameras holding a thick folder of findings. He spoke slowly, each word deliberate, each phrase carrying the weight of truth. Flight 611 was lost due to structural failure caused by improper repair after a previous incident, he said. This failure was not immediate. It developed slowly, over 2 decades, hidden from view. Every flight that followed added to the damage, until the aircraft could no longer bear the strain. This tragedy teaches us that safety is not a single act. It is a lifelong promise that must never be taken for granted. As he finished, silence filled the room. Even the reporters stopped writing for a moment. In that silence, everyone felt it, the invisible thread that connected every passenger, every engineer, every decision made over the plane's 22 years of service. Flight 611 had not simply fallen from the sky. It had been pushed there by time, neglect, and trust misplaced. That night, after the broadcast, Captain Liang returned to the hangar one last time. The reconstruction stood complete, a haunting monument of silver and gray. He walked slowly through the aisles of twisted metal, stopping at the 640th piece, the fragment that had revealed the truth. He reached out and touched it, the cold surface reflecting the pale light above. In that moment, he didn't see machinery, he saw faces. A young mother holding her child. An elderly couple traveling to see their grandchildren. A businessman reading a letter before takeoff. Lives all reduced to fragments and memories. "You deserved better," he whispered. Outside, the sky was clear. The same kind of blue that had filled the horizon on the morning Flight 611 disappeared. The world below moved on, but above it, the air seemed quieter, as if remembering. Airliners still passed through the same corridor in the sky, their lights glimmering faintly in the night. Pilots who flew that route often looked out their windows, knowing what had happened there. Some said they could almost feel it, the weight of the story, the reminder that every safe landing was built on the lessons written in tragedy. Months later, the Taiwanese government unveiled a permanent memorial overlooking the sea. A curved wall of polished steel, engraved with the names of every passenger and crew member, reflected the horizon where the wreckage had once drifted. Families placed flowers and photographs along the base, the smell of salt and wind filling the air. At the ceremony, Captain Liang was asked to speak. His voice was soft but steady. "We can rebuild planes," he said, "but not lives. The lesson of Flight 611 is not just about safety, it is about memory. We must never forget that behind every piece of metal is a story, and behind every decision, a life." When the crowd fell silent, the ocean spoke instead, a soft, endless rhythm against the shore, as if carrying the voices of those who had never returned. The sun dipped below the horizon, its reflection stretching across the water like a final goodbye. And for a brief moment, everyone there, investigators, families, pilots, stood together in stillness, knowing that while Flight 611 had been lost to time, its message would live forever in the skies. That message would echo in every inspection, every checklist, every engineer's weary sigh under the hangar lights. It would remind every pilot who took to the sky that safety isn't built in factories. It's built in vigilance, compassion, and the refusal to forget. The 640th piece of metal, once hidden in the depths of the sea, had become more than evidence. It had become a warning carved into aviation history, whispering the same truth with every passing year, that in the sky there are no small mistakes. Years passed after the official report was released, but the story of Flight 611 never truly ended. It lived on in the memories of those who investigated it, in the hearts of the families who mourned, and in the skies that still carried its echo. For the aviation world, the tragedy had become a symbol, a quiet, haunting reminder that behind every safe journey lies an invisible network of human choices, each one capable of saving or ending hundreds of lives. What had begun as a mystery solved through metal and evidence transformed into something much deeper, a reflection of how fragile perfection truly is, even in a world built on precision. For Captain Liang, the lead investigator, the months that followed were some of the loneliest of his career. Though the case was officially closed, it refused to leave him. Every night, he dreamed of the ocean where the pieces of Flight 611 had rested, and in those dreams, the sound of wind became the sound of rushing air through a broken fuselage. He had worked in aviation safety his entire life, but this case had changed him. It stripped away the illusion that technology alone could protect humanity from tragedy. What truly mattered, he realized, was not just engineering, it was vigilance, integrity, and the humility to never assume that good enough is ever enough. He began giving talks around the world, invited by aviation conferences and universities. Standing before engineers, pilots, and maintenance crews, he told the story of Flight 611 in quiet detail. Negligence, tragedy, and redemption would live forever. Because in the world of flight, where thousands of lives soar through the sky each day, there are no forgotten stories. Every safety check, every cautious engineer, every vigilant pilot carries with them the legacy of those who paid the ultimate price to make the skies safe again. Flight 611 had fallen, but its message rose higher than ever, etched not in metal or in records, but in the conscience of humanity itself. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if you believe that stories like these remind us why safety, truth, and remembrance matter, please consider subscribing to the channel. Here, we honor those who gave everything so that others may fly in peace, and we keep their voices alive, one story at a time.